14, parturition, and then we are going to get into lactation a little bit. So when we think about parturition, one of the things that we need to think about are, the triggers, right? What has to happen for parturition to be initiated? And if we think about what's required for parturition, we should immediately think, oh, we're going to have muscle contractions, right? Because obviously every TV show we've ever seen when somebody's giving birth, we have intense muscle contractions. So what part of the reproductive tract is contracting? The uterus specifically. Which part of the uterus is contracting? The myometrium, that's right. The muscularis layer surrounding the uterus, the myometrium. Okay? Now, this whole time during pregnancy, what has been keeping the myometrium from prematurely contracting? Progesterone. Alright, so progesterone, while it's doing a good job of helping to support nourishment of the fetus, it's also acting on the myometrium to prevent it from contracting. Okay? So it would then stand to reason that the first thing we have to do to initiate parturition is to get rid of progesterone. Okay? So we've got to get rid of progesterone. And if we look here at all of these graphs, right, all of these are progesterone profiles for all different species that we have talked about during this lecture. And you'll see that none of the patterns are the same, right? But the commonality in all of them is that at the very end, progesterone comes crashing down, right? We can all see that. Progesterone has to come crashing down at the end of gestation. And we're going to talk about how progesterone comes down here in a minute. And actually, it's the fetus that controls the onset of parturition in a normal, healthy scenario. Okay? We see here that cortisol, the stress hormone, so this is a steroid hormone, produced by the fetus, rises, and as it rises, progesterone comes down, and then as progesterone comes down, not surprisingly then, we see an increase in estrogen and an increase in prostaglandins. So cortisol from the fetus is the trigger, it's the initiator. So cortisol, again, is a stress hormone. So you could then imagine that there's some threshold level of stress that this fetus begins to sense that will cause it to initiate parturition. Whether that's, a space issue or, the placenta's inability to remove enough toxins, right, enough metabolic byproducts, whatever that might be. The fetus senses that and then starts to produce cortisol. Now I'm going to tell you all a cool story about how they discovered that fetal cortisol, or the fetus itself, before they knew it was cortisol, how they knew that the fetus controlled parturition. So there was a researcher by the name of Phil Juck. He worked with pigs, and he was interested in understanding growth of the piglets. And he had this hypothesis that the fetal brain controlled the rate of growth of the fetus. Okay? And so he thought, you know what, I'm going to test this. So how would you test that hypothesis? What's that? Make him brain dead. Oh, you're so close. So he couldn't make them brain dead. So do you know what he did? He went in during gestation and he cut their heads off. Just decapitated these little pig fetuses. And so to back up, believe it or not, the fetus can live without a head. Right? And guess what? They grew. And so he showed that the fetal brain was not controlling the rate of fetal growth. It is simply nutrients getting transported across the placenta, controlling growth. Now, here was the weird problem, or the weird thing that happened. Day 113 comes along, and they're waiting for all these sows to farrow. You know, they're going to, like, collect the fetuses and do all their necropsies and look at organ development and all that stuff. I mean, not the brain, because obviously there wasn't one. But all the rest of the organs that are there. And they didn't farrow. And day 114 comes along, and they didn't farrow. And 115 comes along, and they didn't farrow. And they didn't, and they didn't, and they didn't. And so they had to go in and terminate the pregnancies and do C-sections and whatnot. But that was a trigger, like, oh, the fetus is in charge of this. And in actuality, there are also clinical, once they started looking at this, there's clinical examples of this. So there's a plant, Reproduction californicum, okay? And if ruminant species consume this plant at the wrong time of gestation, when the fetus is developing its hypothalamus and pituitary, those females won't calve or won't give birth to lambs. And they've reported calves that weighed almost 200 pounds. That's twice the size, at least twice the size. So those two lines of evidence kind of prove that, oh, the fetus is in charge of signaling parturition. So now we're going to talk about how. Okay? As y'all might imagine, I'm going to love this slide. So what happens is ACTH here is produced in the anterior pituitary. And ACTH causes the adrenal glands to produce cortisol. And like I said, first thing we got to do, we got to get rid of progesterone. So what are the sources of progesterone? The corpus luteum, that's one, and the placenta. So I have two sources. So how do I get rid of each one? So fetal cortisol stimulates the release of prostaglandin F2 alpha to induce luteolysis. So that's very straightforward. We got that one, right? That was exam 2. Cortisol is causing the release of prostaglandin F2 alpha. Prostaglandin F2 alpha induces luteolysis. Simple. So one source, progesterone, is now gone. The other source is the placenta. Okay? So how do we get rid of progesterone production from the placenta? So what happens is that when cortisol is produced by the adrenal gland, it causes an increase in steroid synthesis enzymes like aromatase. Okay? And so as aromatase increases, then the progesterone that the placenta has been making is now being converted into estradiol. So we have a decline in progesterone because estradiol production is now going up. Okay? That's why they crossed in this previous graph. Going the wrong way. That's why progesterone and estrogen cross, is because the progesterone that's being made is being converted into estradiol. So now we've gotten rid of progesterone. Okay? glycolysis through PGF2 alpha to get rid of the corpus luteum, and enzymatic conversion from progesterone to estradiol in the placenta. So progesterone is gone. Now that progesterone is gone, what was causing the myometrium to stay quiet is also gone. So now the myometrium is capable of contracting. Okay? So now that the myometrium is capable, now let's talk about what causes it to actually contract and the regulation of those contractions. So here we've got them, right here, myometrial contractions, and you'll notice that there are two causes of contractions. PGF2 alpha binding to its receptor on the myometrium, and estradiol binding to its receptor on the myometrium, both cause myometrial contractions. Okay? And I'm going to go to the next slide because I think it shows it better. So, PGF2 alpha and estradiol causing contractions on the myometrium. And as the myometrium contracts, what does it do to that calf? It pushes it up, right? And that cervix, or that calf, is going to butt up against the cervix. Okay? And as it hits the cervix has neurons within it that sense that pressure, that pushing up against the cervix. And when those neurons get activated, then that sends a signal to the posterior pituitary to release oxytocin. Okay? Oxytocin then travels through the blood, and it binds to its receptor on the myometrium. And causes what? Another contraction. Okay? What does that contraction then cause? More pressure. What does that more pressure then cause? More oxytocin. And what have we just generated here? A positive feedback loop. That's right. So we now have a positive feedback loop. More pressure equals more oxytocin equals more contractions, more pressure, more. Until what? Well, until there's no more pressure, right? If the pressure is the signal, then you got to alleviate the pressure. So normally the pressure is alleviated when the calf comes out. Okay? We talked briefly at some point this semester, I seem to recall, about why we put women on bed rest, right? Think about a woman here instead of this cow. So on a cow, that cervix is up at the pelvic rim, right? And the calf is low in the belly. But a woman would have a different anatomy. A woman, the cervix would be on the bottom, and the fetus would be sitting on top, causing that direct pressure. So if we want to prevent preterm birth, because we've got minor contractions or something, then we put a woman on bed rest, turn them horizontal, so that we eliminate pressure, or reduce pressure, right? That's the goal. The mechanism is the same. But because the anatomy is different, we can put a woman on bed rest, but there's no need to try to put a cow on bed rest, right? Just solely because of anatomy. This positive feedback loop is obviously very aggressive, which is also why we are so concerned about birthing problems. And they're so costly, right? So we have dystocia. So anytime we have an incorrect presentation of the offspring, right? This calf is coming out correctly, right? 2 front feet and a head. But boy, have I seen every possible thing. I've seen this, I've seen this, I've seen this, I've seen that. All kinds of different things. Okay? And each one of them has to be corrected to get that offspring out. And if not, we can have all kinds of problems. So, like as example, this year at my house, I've had 2 this year. that only the head came out. Both front legs are back. Okay? Now what happens when the head, it constricts the neck, and all of a sudden the head will start to swell. You wouldn't think your head can swell a lot because it's like a lot of bone. Oh no, they'll swell. Big time. Can get almost double their size. Then when you get them out, now they can't breathe sometimes, or they certainly can't nurse. So now you've got to tube them. And you have to tube them for a couple of days while the swelling is going down. Otherwise, they'll get milk down their lungs, then they'll get pneumonia, and they'll die, right? When you get a breech baby, so that's one coming backwards, okay? What's the problem with breech babies? Other than they're backwards. They have a very high mortality rate. So what's the signal? What's the signal for a newborn to breathe? Like when this calf is born, how does this calf know to take a breath? What happens? No, that'd be oxygen. Oh, no. The amnion's going to break early. It's when the umbilical cord breaks. Okay, so think about this calf coming over the pelvis. As it's coming out, that umbilical cord is going to come right across that pelvic opening, and it's going to tear. Okay? And as soon as it tears, that's the signal to breathe. Now think about a calf coming backwards. As the back end and rump come out, and it comes over the pelvic rim, it's going to break when the head's still inside. And the first thing that calf's going to do is all that amniotic fluid. Now you got fluid in the lungs, and if you can't get it out, then it's going to suffocate, basically. So when you solve a dystocia problem with a breech baby, you have to make sure you super dilate it. Like you spend time just trying to get them dilate. And then when you pull fast. It's the only time you pull fast. Everything else is all slow and careful and easy. But when they're breech, you pull them out fast so that they're basically out by the time they get that signal to breathe. And if you do that, breech baby is no problem. I think now with women, if you have a breech baby, I mean, they'll try to turn them. Right? They'll try, but if they just C-section, get them out. They don't ever deliver them breech. All right. So that's the regulation of parturition. Starts with estradiol and PGF2 alpha causing those initial contractions, which then initiate that positive feedback loop of pressure and oxytocin. And that's also, and you talk about dystocia, that's also why parturition is dangerous, is because you can lose females that way. You can't, I mean, not just lose the offspring, you can lose the mom too, if you're not checking them on a regular basis and they exhaust themselves. They will ultimately die. All right, so that concludes chapter 14. Now we're going to talk about chapter 15, which is the repair of the reproductive tract after giving birth. Okay? And most of the time, we're going to spend talking about cattle. And that's because if you think about sheep and goats, which are seasonal breeders and have a relatively short gestation length, they have tons and tons of time to repair. Okay? And if we think about mares and pigs to a little bit lesser degree, they have the least invasive placenta. So the repair is easier. But cattle have a slightly more complicated placental type, right? They have the cotyledonary placentas that all interdigitate. We talked about retained placentas and things like that. And they have a long gestation length, right? They have a roughly 9-month gestation length. And if I want this cow to calve every March, as example, right? If that's when I want her to calve, then if she has a 9-month gestation, I only have 3 months for her uterus to repair and to rebreathe. It's not a tremendous amount of time, right? So it's very important that we get uterine repair. And we're going to introduce a new term, and we're going to see this term twice today. Once we're talking about the uterus, and the other time we're talking about the mammary gland. But it's the term involution. So uterine involution is the uterus returning back to the pre-pregnancy state. So going back to an empty, healthy, open uterus that is capable of sustaining another pregnancy. And 4 things need to happen during uterine involution. Okay? So obviously we're going to get a decrease in uterine size. Think about this, right? That cow had an 80-pound calf plus all those fluids, right? The uterus was this big around. And it's got to go back to that size that y'all are handling when y'all AI, right? Or dissect. It's got to go back to that. So that's a tremendous decrease in uterine size. And uterine volume. We talked about volume when we talked about women, right? Giving birth and needing to decrease that volume to help prevent blood loss. There's expulsion of lochia. Lochia is a very benign way of saying all the dead, nasty, grody bits of stuff that are left over after giving childbirth. So any small remnants of the placenta, and there will be some, right? Even on the best situations, any secretions that are kind of pussy and inflamed looking, all of that is going to be lochia. And you might see, I see at the house all the time, ewes that gave birth 3 weeks ago, and they still have a little bit of blood coming out, a little bit of mucousy, cloudy looking stuff coming out. That's all lochia. And it's just a flushing system just to get all the bad stuff out, right? Because you have to get back to an environment that an embryo could thrive in, right? And then we have to have endometrial repair. And this slide is shown here. Right? Here's that silent heat we learned about for chapter 7. So here's that silent heat. And then these are our opportunities to get this cow pregnant again so that she can have a calf every year. And this is a tremendous, tremendous cost to the industry. And one of the biggest times that we have this issue is with first calf heifers. Okay? This is why we work so hard to breed the low birth weight bulls. We also work hard to get them bred earlier in the season so that by the time they have a little bit more time to repair. Because if you think about it from a cost perspective, right, it costs a lot of money to grow a heifer up to get her pregnant and have her first calf, right? It's relatively costly, and it took a lot of time. So she gives you one calf and then never rebreeds, so you have to sell her. You had a tremendous input cost for one product, right? That's a losing money proposition. That's way worse than if I have a cow who on her 10th calf can't get appropriate endometrial repair and she's not pregnant, right? Because I had the cost of growing that cow up divided across 10 products, right? 10 calves, as opposed to one, right? So keeping a healthy uterine environment, getting these uteri to involute and repair really helps the economics of the cow herd. All right, so here's just some cool pictures, actually kind of gross, of cows that have just given birth, right? So here's the cervix, right? They're just demonstrating they can easily put a rod through it. It's still open. They got a lot of lochia here, secretions. Here's the empty sac that is the uterus. Doesn't look like a uterus, right? Traditional uterine horns. Doesn't look anything like you've seen. Here's the corpus albicans. This cow just happened to have two. Doesn't mean she had twins, but it does mean she could have had twins if they both fertilized and both developed. So we don't know on that one. Here are the placentomes, well, excuse me, the caruncles, right? The cotyledons have been ripped out. We have the remaining caruncle, which is part of the endometrium. And when we talk about endometrial repair, this is kind of what we're talking about. Look at this necrosis, right? So these caruncles here either were damaged with trauma during the birthing process, or there's more cotyledonary tissue that stayed that's now died, right? Because it doesn't have a blood supply. So all of that would contribute to more lochia. Contrast that with these caruncles over here, which look fairly healthy, right? Not a lot of hemorrhage, not a lot of blood, necroses. Day 4, still very open, still a lot of lochia. Uterus is getting smaller. Right? Really a lot of secretions at this point in time in the repair. Day 10, cervix is starting to tighten up a little bit. Can still get the rod through there. The CL is really starting to degrade. There's a small antral follicle amount, right? So follicular activity is starting. These aren't going to get dominant. They're not there yet. They still probably they're in that negative energy balance, right? So they probably don't have enough GnRH release to get this thing to dominance. But the lack of progesterone, now we get some follicular activity, right? And we can see that. And the uterus is getting smaller continually. Still a lot of lochia. 15 to 11? No. So here's a different cow. Notice on this uterus, notice how hemorrhaged it is. Okay? This cow, when she gave birth, had trauma. She likely had a difficult dyscocial delivery and was quite problematic. And so this would be a strong candidate for having trouble getting to rebreathe. And now by day 20, now this cow also had some trauma, but now we can start to denote, more traditional uterine horns. And again, we're getting more antral follicles starting to develop, more follicular activity. And so it won't be long before these cows start to cycle again. Now, just because they start cycling doesn't necessarily still mean that the uterus is in significant enough repair to get pregnant again. This is also what we think a lot about beef cattle because that's mostly what we see here in Texas. But this is also a major issue for the dairy industry. If you think about, dairies being these intensive, confined operations in these dry lot scenarios, it's just a dirtier environment, right? Compared to being out on grass pasture. It's just dirtier. And so the likelihood that you're going to get more bacterial contamination when this reproductive tract is more open is greater. So we have a higher incidence of, we call it endometritis, right? So infections of the uterus in postpartum dairy cows than we have with postpartum beef cows. All right, so let's talk a little bit briefly about the mammary gland. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time about development of the mammary gland. Oh, go ahead.
We talked about the new way with IVF where we could aspirate the follicles. Can we aspirate those follicles with cycles?
Yep, we could. We absolutely could go in. These little antral follicles right there, yeah, we could absolutely go in and aspirate those and start an IVF program. remember, the only reason we had to stop the IVF aspirations was because the calf got too big and it pulled the ovaries down into the belly. The follicular activity never stopped. It's just the location of it. I couldn't get to it, right? So now with the calf gone, and the weight gone, everything's back up close to the top. So we could do that, no problem. So the mammary gland, as you might expect, starts its developmental process as a fetus, okay? So normally I've already given the fetal programming lecture, but I switched it, and now I'm doing fetal programming last on Thursday. So you'll kind of understand a little bit more about why this might be important after the lecture on Thursday, in terms of how we might go about influencing the development of the mammary gland. But in a female, mostly female. Obviously, males still have nipples, but we only care about the females, so let's just go there. So there's something called the mammary ridge. And what happens is there are signals down here in what's called the stromal cells. They don't even have them drawn here, down in this beige tan part. There are cells down here that will emit signals that cause the development of the mammary bud. It starts to invaginate and grow down into the tissue. And so we get primary budding, and then new signals will cause secondary budding. So all this branching. And ultimately, once the branching is formed, we get what's called canalization, which is the development of these lactiferous ducts that will allow for the milk to leave the alveolus to go to the teat. And notice also that on the end of each of these buds here, these cells are surrounded by myoepithelial cells. When we talk about how milk gets ejected from the mammary gland, these myoepithelial cells are going to be major players in this process. So all of this is occurring during fetal life. Even though, for the most part, we think about mammary development occurring after that female's already grown and starts to be pregnant, right? But this is all occurring during fetal life. Don't worry, you do not have to know how many teats all the different species have. So now let's talk about how the mammary gland grows throughout life. And I think this is our next to last slide. So we just got done talking about this prenatal development of this stromal tissue, where we have the formation of the ductal system and the development of the budding and the lactiferous ducts. Before puberty, not a lot going on. After puberty, we start to get an increase in secretory tissue. Okay? So, what should that tell us about what is controlling the growth of secretory tissue? Hormones, which ones? Right? Estrogen and progesterone, right? Because as these females start to cycle, they have big swings in estrogen and progesterone. And so that's stimulating secretory tissue growth. Then during pregnancy, we get continued increase in ductal tissue development as well as secretory tissue development. We didn't talk about them, but there are a number of hormones that are produced by the placenta called prolactin, placental lactogen, right? Lactogen, lactin. These are hormones that are derived from the placenta that act on the mammary gland to stimulate mammary gland growth and function. So it's not surprising then that as the placenta is forming and developing, then we're getting increases in both ductal tissue growth and secretory tissue growth. And then after she gives birth, right, the mammary gland still continues to develop tissue even in the first couple of weeks after giving birth. So we don't reach peak mammary gland tissue development until early in the first lactation. Okay? Now, this graph is a little bit confusing if you are talking about cattle, and that's pretty much what we're going to talk about. Because, this is why. Okay? What this graph shows is that at the end of the first lactation, the mammary gland is going to undergo mammary gland involution. Okay? We also call this drying off. Right? So we're going to dry off the cow, and her mammary gland is going to stop producing milk, and it's going to regress in size, kind of go back down to normal. And then this graph is showing that after uterine involution occurs, we have a second pregnancy. But that's not real, okay? That's not real. That cow is already pregnant. The cow is going to get pregnant about here, okay? So she's already gestating her second calf while she's still lactating to feed her first calf. And we typically wean calves at about 7 months of age. So we wean her calf at 7 months of age to give us a few months to dry her off, to allow the second calf to get into that last third of gestation, which is that immense nutrient demand, right? So we can grow the second calf before initiating the second lactation. So there's not a gap here between the first lactation and the second pregnancy. So this is just drawn poorly, right? If you grew up raising cattle, that would be intuitive. You would know that. But if you didn't grow up raising cattle, you might look at this slide and not understand the beef industry at all. Okay? So that's an important thing to note. Now, in the second pregnancy, what do we know about, or what do we notice about the second lactation compared to the first lactation? We had continued growth, right? It grew even more. So what is that going to mean for milk production in the second lactation versus the first lactation? There's more milk. So what would that mean then for calf weaning weights for a cow's second calf versus her first calf? Bigger calves, right? So everything is better once we get into our second and third lactation. So we don't get, after the second lactation, we don't get more mammary gland growth. Okay? But from the first lactation to the second lactation, there is continued growth. That's a second reason why we really need to get these heifers pregnant again so that we can get another calf, because not only will that other calf be a revenue source, but it's also going to be a bigger calf. So more revenue from that calf. And then at the end of that lactation, again, we're going to continue to undergo these involution events. Now, what happens, clinically speaking, when we get poor mammary gland involution? What develops? Or what can develop? Mastitis. Right? So mastitis is an infection of the mammary gland. Now in a cow's got 4 quarters. And you might only get mastitis in one. That's not that bad. Okay? Because actually it's kind of cool. The other 3 quarters, her next lactation, will almost make up for the loss of that quarter. Okay? But let's say we've got sheep or goats. Well, they don't have quarters, they have halves. 2 halves, 2 teats. 2 functional teats anyway. So if I lose a half and she has twins, what happens? Well, you don't have to, but if you don't bottle feed, then one of your offspring is going to get the lion's share of the milk, and the other is going to be a little runny booger, right? So what's going to happen? So you have to properly manage nutritionally this involution process, right? So we spend a lot of money feeding the females at this time because we want them to milk, right? And we need a high nutrient intake to maximize milk production. But before we wean, we want to decrease that intake plan. We want to make mom start to think, oh, things aren't all that great right now. Now, realize she's pregnant. If we're talking cattle, she's pregnant. So we got to be very careful with this. But we want to make her think, oh, I need to stop lactating. I need to kick this calf off. So that we don't have issues with mastitis. All right, the last thing we're going to talk about, last slide, is the regulation of milk ejection from the teat. Okay? So, what causes the milk to come out? So, there has to be a stimulus to activate the mammary gland. And that stimulus is the suckling on the teat. Now, sometimes if you go to a dairy, right, it doesn't have to be the calf, right? Because if we put the milk machine on, those cows will start milking. Okay, they'll start releasing the milk, but not always. Sometimes this happens a lot on heifers. You put the milk machine on, and they're sucking away. Nothing's coming out. Nothing's coming out. Okay, well, why not? The machine, did it lose its vacuum? No, it's the female hasn't released her milk. It's not just the physical suckling part. It's the stimulus of that signals to the brain to cause the milk release. Okay? So what happens in a normal scenario is that stimulus, suckling or the milk machine, sends a signal to the posterior pituitary to cause it to release oxytocin. Oxytocin then travels through the blood to our alveolus here, which is our cells that are producing the milk, and it binds to its receptor on those myoepithelial cells that I mentioned. Notice how the myoepithelial cells form like this web around the alveolus. And these myoepithelial cells are kind of muscle cells. So when oxytocin binds to them, it causes them to contract. Okay? And as those myoepithelial cells contract, they literally squeeze milk out of the lactiferous ducts in the alveolus down into the ductal network to go down to the teat cistern. And that's when milk will come out, after the release of oxytocin. So, back in the day when A&M had a dairy, I used to work there. I used to milk cows on the weekends. And so, you would bring in this new heifer, you put the milk machine on, and nothing would happen. Well, we needed to get the milk out of her, so what did we do? We gave her a shot of oxytocin. Okay? And it's amazing. It's amazing. The cow standing there, milk machine's on, nothing's coming out. Right? We had these little glass bulbs, we could see the milk. Nothing's coming. Right? Give it a shot. Boom, shot. And all of a sudden, here comes milk. Right? It's obvious that the hormone is what's causing the milk release. Now, you got to be careful with that. Because some of those cows could get addicted to oxytocin. So they come stand in the parlor and look at you like, where's my shot? I need my hit, right? Be like drug addicts. And so you have to start like weaning them off the oxytocin so that they will release their milk. On the other hand, you got other cows, they don't even have to have the teat suctions hooked up to them yet. And they're spraying milk everywhere, right? Just the sights and sounds of the milking product itself is causing oxytocin release. And the milk's just shooting out everywhere, and I'm like, oh my God, we're losing money. What's going on the ground, right? So it all depends on that individual female. Yes.
So which one would you rather have in like a operation scenario, the cow that shoots it everywhere, the cow you have to give shots?
You totally rather have the cow that shoots it everywhere. Because the shot is needy and expensive, right? That syringe and needle cost more than the little bit of milk. I mean, because I'm exaggerating, right? I mean, it's literally spraying everywhere. But it's not like a fire hose, right? The teat is only so big, right? So we're losing 10 cents of milk on the ground versus the 57-cent syringe and needle. But when you milk 10,000 cows, 57 cents adds up, right? So, plus that cow you have to give it a shot, it takes a pain in the butt, it takes more time, you can't keep the parma flowing. Those parmas, it's all about flow, right? It's about getting them in and out, in and out, in and out. Time is money. All right, I'm done. See y'all later.